The final category is misleading argument techniques, which can contain even proper arguments, but are misleading. So the point is not really whether they're valid or unsound, but it could be the case that good reasons are being offered for something, but the way in which those reasons are offered can be called misleading. Again, so it's late in the lecture, so you want to watch another video, right? Here we go again. Perhaps you can recognize the misleading argument technique in this example. All right.
Hands-free driving. Cars that park themselves. An unmanned car driven by a search engine company. We've seen that movie. It ends with robots harvesting our bodies for energy. This is the all-new 2011 Dodge Charger, leader of the human resistance.
All right. Another silly example, an actual advertisement. So, of course, the intent of advertisers is usually to rely on rhetorical force, but if we assume this to be an argument, indeed, so we're assuming that not the rhetorical force is implied, like scare tactics in this case, but indeed, Maxime, it's a good answer if you were to say the effect is rhetorical of this advertisement. But we're assuming that an argument is offered, and let's say the argument is structured like this, right? So we shouldn't drive. We should drive stick, right? We shouldn't use automatic gearboxes because in the end, cars will drive themselves, and that will result in robots who will kill us and harvest us for our organs, right? So I'm going from just deciding between whether to shift the gears in your car yourself or having that part of driving your car automated to self-driving cars to robots who are going to eat you alive, right? So you should recognize a slope here from things getting from how they are now, you deciding on how to shift gears in your car, to very bad, the robot future. So indeed, this is a hell of a slippery slope if we consider this to be an argument. And that's a misleading argument technique. So that means specifically that if somebody offers a slippery slope, I mean, it could be that the steps explained, looked at individually, make sense, but it doesn't necessarily mean that if we decide on one, the final step is guaranteed to happen. And just showing the final potential results of all those steps, the end of the slippery slope, is a misleading technique. So let's look at another global warming related example. So global warming has come to be a hotly contested issue. Are there valid concerns that we should consider, or is global warming just the latest manufactured crisis to cash in on the public's fears and generate new support for global governance, global carbon taxes, and other oppressive policies? So let's just focus on that first step. Do you recognize any forms of misleading argumentation here? Just the first paragraph. Are there valid concerns, or is it just the latest manufactured crisis to cash in on the public's fears and generate new support for global governance, global carbon taxes, and other oppressive policies? Pick A or B. What is it? I'm offering you the choice of a dilemma, right? Indeed, Alexa. False dilemma. But Britt is saying it's also a slippery slope, right? Why do you think it's also a slippery slope?
I thought because he's saying Western bureaucrats have testified there, we exhale as a pollutant, and then he goes all the way into we have to buy a government permit just to emit carbon dioxide into the atmosphere from our own lungs.
Yeah.
That's kind of like a big step.
It is a very big step, and indeed that would be a misleading technique. So I would agree that also that part is, you could call that a slippery slope. So we have a false dilemma, right? It's either a valid concern or it's the end of all times, right? So that's a false dilemma. You're just getting two options, and those are restricting. So that's a false dilemma. And there's a slippery slope. So if we're now concluding that CO2 is a pollutant, then you have to buy permits for breathing. Indeed. So I would add to that there's also a weak analogy in there. But we could disagree on that. But you could say that claiming that the air that we exhale is a pollutant because the fact that cars pollute the environment with CO2 and we exhale CO2, that means that we're both exhaling pollutants is questionable to my mind. So I would call that a weak analogy as well. So it's a very rich example. We have an example of a false dilemma, a slippery slope, and a weak analogy in one. All right. So I gave... Sorry. Yeah, go ahead.
Circumstantial as well.
Why?
Because the government...
right. Yeah. Sorry, go ahead.
Because they get tax money, right?
Yeah. Yeah. Good point. So the first paragraph and the final part of that. So one of those two options is it's a manufactured crisis, basically generated because in the day they want to grab your tax money, right? So and they would supposedly benefit from that. So if we would make that explicit in Reconstruction, and we would say, well, the only reason why government is saying that we should tax CO2 is that they would benefit from it because taxes means more money for the government. Then you could call that ad hominem circumstantial as well. Yeah, good point. Thanks. So we talked about the Babel fish, right, in previous lecture, I guess, on Friday. And then we said, well, this is the whole argument, right? So the argument goes something like this: I refuse to prove that I exist, for proof denies faith, and without faith I'm nothing, etc., etc. So we talked about the argument. I hope you remember it. And my question then is, what type of fallacy or pseudo-reasoning do you recognize? If you go back to the slides of Friday, what I said there was that the Babel fish is either the result of random chance or selection by evolution by natural selection, or it is proof that God exists, right? So that's a false dilemma right there. You're saying either this is an improbable event under evolutionary, predicted by evolutionary theory, or God exists. That's a false dilemma, right? It isn't, of course, the case that something is either very unlikely or can be predicted on the basis of evolution, or it's proof that God exists. There can be an in-between option in which you say, well, it's difficult to explain using evolutionary theory as we now understand it, but it doesn't necessarily have to mean that it's proof that God exists. So I would say that there's a false dilemma in there. I would also say there's an example of equivocation in there. And if you were then to check the backside of the package of Abilify, and you would see what difference did Abilify make, and if people were on a placebo or Abilify, and then they measured the extent to which it helped using the following. People had lower depression scores. Their scores improved by 3 points more than placebo on a scale from 0 to 60. Right? So if you were to take a placebo, you would feel 6 points better on the depression scale. If you were to take Abilify, the medicines being advertised, you would feel 9 points better. Would you then say, well, that's up to 30% more symptom relief, or would you find that misleading? And what type of form of pseudo-reasoning do you recognize here? We talked about it at the beginning of the year, or the beginning of the month, at the introduction. In the introduction, I gave you an example of confusing absolute and relative differences, which you can do as an advertiser to, well, basically persuade people to buy your stuff without necessarily saying anything that's not true. Right? So there is indeed 30% more symptom relief. So a 9-point improvement compared to a 6-point improvement is indeed 30% higher. But the absolute improvement, those 3 points on a 60-point scale, so the absolute improvement is much, much lower than what's depicted here. So they're not saying something that's untrue, but it is misleading, because they imply, or they want people to think that I'm going to feel 30% better, 30% less depressed if I take this medicine. But that's not what it says. It says that the rate of improvement is 30% higher if you take this than compared to a placebo. The absolute increase in your mood, if you take this on average, would be just 3 points on a 60-point scale, which is much lower. All right. Confusing the absolute and relative differences is a misleading argument technique. So with watching the time, what I'm going to leave in is an example of a red herring, but we're not going to discuss it now. What you should be able to see and realize using this example and the examples in the book is that when using a red herring, people could actually be giving proper arguments, but it's not directly related to what people are trying to debate. So if somebody were to say depression exists because it's clearly stated in the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual that people with these type of symptoms are depressed, and it says so in the DSM because those symptoms are caused by depression, you should be able to recognize a form of circular reasoning or begging the question, right? So the premise, indeed, Quinty, the premise assumes the conclusion to be true, which is a form of begging the question, indeed. Very good. So there are three types of circular reasoning, you might say. So you could literally repeat the premise. I had one example of the first one in one of the weekly assignments, right? I said something about bananas being the best fruit because bananas are the best fruit. And that argument that confused some people, it is a circular reasoning, but it's also valid, right? So this first example of circular reasoning, God exists because God exists, is indeed valid. I mean, the premise is literally the same as the conclusion. So for sure, if the premises were true, the conclusion would have to be true as well. It's also uninformative because it's circular, because you already have to assume the conclusion to be true in the premises, which is basically the most useful definition of begging the question. The premises presuppose the truth of the conclusion. So the Bible states that God exists. The Bible is the word of God, therefore God exists. The third variant you don't have to know by heart now just yet. It's something we're going to cover in the second and the third block of the course, which is mainly the third block of the course. So forget it's there, the third example. Focus on the first and the second one. So in which the premises are indeed literally the same as the conclusion, and the premises presuppose the conclusion of the truth. And the third one is interesting, but we'll return to that later in the course. All right. I think this will be the final one then. That's what I promised. Students don't want their tuition fees to be increased. They'd rather spend their money on beer. Given that beer drinking is deleterious to achieving academic goals, we should go ahead and raise tuition fees. And not incidentally that there's a picture of a straw target beside it. So basically this is an example of the straw target, but could somebody explain to me why this can be considered an example of a straw target argument? Or misleading argument technique.
Perhaps because it's an oversimplification.
Mm-hmm.
That's just looking at one. So it simplifies. It gives a very, let's say, simple example that doesn't really make sense to base like a decision.
Yeah, you're right, or you're in the right direction. I mean, it does make sense to base a decision on this. It might be one of the considerations in thinking about why students might not be willing to have their tuition fees to be increased, right? I mean, of course, buying beer is one of the things you might be doing with your money. So that's one of the reasons why you might not want your tuition fees increased. It's only, the thing is, and the misleading thing is that that's not the best reason you have for arguing that you don't want your tuition fees to be raised. So focusing on the worst argument that could be considered in a debate, for example, and then completely destroying that argument is a misleading form of argumentation, which is called the straw target. At least the book calls it the straw target. It used to be called the straw man fallacy in the book as well, but I don't know what happened there. Perhaps some social justice, and they made it the straw target instead. I'm just thinking out loud here. I don't know. So basically what you're doing, and I found this more easy to illustrate with the straw man, is that you basically construct a weaker version of the argument that your opponent is presenting, and then you destroy that version of the argument. And you can easily destroy that version of the argument because it is a weakened version. So it's not necessarily untrue what you're saying. So it's not necessarily untrue that beer is more important than higher tuition fees, but it's also not a very good representation of all that is at stake in the argument. And if you're aiming for that effect, then you're trying to demolish that straw target to win a debate, which is a misleading argument technique. This is an important point because we'll return to this in the second and the third block when we consider reasoning about psychological research. But for now, just remember that misrepresenting what's at stake or misrepresenting the argument of your opponent in such a way that it becomes weaker and easier to deconstruct or demolish for you, that's a form of the straw target misleading argument technique. Yeah, I had another example of equivocation relating to the shampoo example you just saw. You'll be able to figure it out. So the world's number one hair color is ambiguous, right? So, and if you try to convince people that who are interested in the best hair color, and you tempt them into thinking that since your shampoo is the number one hair color, that must be the best hair color, that would be using equivocation in your argumentation. It doesn't necessarily mean the same thing, right? Having the best hair color or the number one hair color. It could also be the most common hair color, for example, and that would make it the number one hair color as well. All right, we talked about formal fallacies, we talked about substantive fallacies, and we talked about formal argument techniques, which basically gives you all you need for the exam on Thursday, right? We talked about developing a critical disposition. We talked about how you can recognize arguments and how you can recognize, faulty argument techniques and fallacies. And we talked about how you can properly reconstruct an argument and then assess it. And hopefully the fallacies we talked about, or the forms of pseudo reasoning we talked about, help you to analyze arguments and reconstruct arguments, because you already know common types of both valid and forceful arguments that can occur and that give good reasons for drawing conclusions, but also arguments that rely on bad reasons, as we talked about today, and misleading faulty argument techniques that we talked about today.